5 seconds, Dr. Tracy. Have a great show.
For years, I've been on television as an expert. Once you see the sausage being made, you understand that the news isn't newsing. They are creating narratives. They are feeding us what they want us to know. With this podcast, I'm taking on the 6 media conglomerates that control what you know, and I'm putting information you can use into the world. What we don't know is the weekly, narrative-free, pundit-free, commentator-free zone. I'm Dr. Tracy Pearson, your host. Let's do a show. Hi, I'm Dr. Tracy Pearson, and this is What We Don't Know. If this is your first time coming across this podcast, welcome. And if you've heard or seen us before, welcome back. We're glad to have you back. When I conceived of this series, I wanted to introduce you to people who were not on television, people who were not on radio, and people who we needed to hear from because they knew things that we needed to know. Such is the case today with my guest, Dr. Bryan Lay, who is a food scientist. We talk all things food science, all things food regulation, all things food safety. And we also talk about his book. It is called 150 Food Science Questions Answered and Cook Smarter, Cook Better. So with that, I know you are going to love this interview, and I know that you are going to love Bryan. It's my pleasure to welcome to the show Dr. Bryan Lay, who is a consulting food scientist. Thanks for joining me, Bryan.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
You wrote a book. It's a great book. I'm going to talk a lot more about this book during this episode, but you wrote a book called 150 Food Science Questions Answered. I have it right here. If you could see it up close, you would see that I have dog-eared many pages in this book. And I'm going to give you a chance to talk about this book with the audience. But first, I would love it if you would introduce yourself to the audience.
Yeah, definitely. So I'm a food scientist, and I graduated with my PhD in food science from the University of Wisconsin-Madison back in 2020, which is great because I didn't know about food science beforehand, but I was able to find the program. And after I graduated, I just jumped into consulting because funny enough, I couldn't find a job. So I started my own business, and since then I've been working with food companies and food startups.
I had no idea that you could get a PhD in food science. Can you tell me a little bit more about where that was and what they teach in that program?
Yeah, like you, I also had no idea. And when I started, I'd found the program through a scientific journal. And I was really excited because it was a way for me to better understand how is food made, like what are the food safety issues that are a big concern, and what's some of the research that's involved in making our food healthier and better for you.
So the food supply is in the news often. It's hit or miss, whether they spend a lot of time on it, but it is in the news often. And before we get into the specifics of some of these issues, could you tell us a little bit more about how food is regulated in this country, in the United States?
Yeah, so there's a number of different agencies that oversee food. At the federal level, it's primarily the FDA and the USDA, and they have 2 different categories of food that are part of their jurisdiction. So, the FDA pretty much does everything else that the USDA doesn't, and USDA does a lot of agricultural products, so primarily meat, and the initial ingredients that are processed into the ingredients that we see at the consumer level. But honestly, a lot happens at the state level, and really, actually, a lot of regulations are implemented at the county level and the city level. So the FDA only comes into play, as well as the USDA, if there are bad actors and someone is whistleblowing and telling the federal government that there's a serious issue.
So if we're dealing with something like bird flu, I guess that would be the FDA that would be concerned, or the USDA that would be concerned about um, the cattle or poultry, and would they be working together on these issues? Would the CDC be involved? I mean, very
Yeah,
complicated.
very complicated. There's definitely a lot of overlap, and I think that drives a lot of the confusion. And certainly, it all starts at that sort of county level and in the state level, where if there's a particular issue, they focus on that. But then once it crosses state lines, so if you have meat that's been produced in, let's say, Indiana, and then it gets shipped out to Oregon, then the federal government starts to inquire with more interest. So if there's any concern across state lines, or if there is a possibility that things will spread, then the federal government will step in to rectify that. But other than that, usually it's state agencies will work with whatever's within their boundaries and borders first.
So that's new to me, hearing that it's really the state level that is primarily responsible as the first level of protection for people and their health when it comes to the food supply.
Mm-hmm.
So depending on who's in charge of the government at a particular time, that is going to impact our health. Am I understanding that?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really interesting to see sort of that dynamic, because it kind of gets rolled back and then re-implemented between who's responsible, who's the person that needs to take responsibility and step in. And like you said, depending on who is in charge of that state, and the different regulatory bodies there, and it can be kind of a coin toss. I mean, we definitely see it pretty often where something that is a big concern that could spread, is not really something that's a major concern for the state, which is really funny to think about. But only once it starts to spill over does someone come in and ensure that doesn't become a bigger issue. So it's a little disconcerting, certainly, and there's not as much I would say consistency from state to state, especially given the number of resources, the financial incentives. Certainly different food companies have different ways of implementing their particular rules. And there's also different ideas of how those rules should be implemented. So it really is very disparate, and there's a lot of different lines drawn. And people don't like to let their jurisdictions be encroached upon. For example, there's really great new bill that's being pushed to determine if the FDA should have more data as far as these recalls and outbreaks, and if they should be able to have access to this data at the state level. And apparently, and honestly, this was news to me too, that there was actually no access by the federal government.
Wow. So I just sort of want to play around with this bird flu issue. I've seen a lot on Twitter about people being very concerned about this, at least on my corner of Twitter. I refuse to call it X. And and so, but when I see people talking about it, there's a lot of blame being thrown at the CDC. Now, as I understand what you're saying, when food crosses state lines, let's say milk crosses state lines, that's when the FDA would become involved, because of there would be, let's say, a contamination, or it would be the USDA, one of those would become involved, because there would be some contaminated product out there. Am I correct in understanding that?
Yeah, absolutely.
And so when people are sort of slapping at the CDC over the fact that we might have another pandemic brewing in our own agriculture, it's really the state government that implements those regulations in that given state where that, let's say, cattle are located. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly. And it's up to them to interpret that. Mm-hmm.
So, and I'm making some broad generalizations here. It sounds like if the government isn't concerned about public health or isn't concerned about another pandemic, that our best defense, the state government, may in fact fail the entire country. Is that fair?
That is definitely a fair statement. Certainly, if there's not enough oversight at the state level, there's not a whole lot that the federal government can do until it becomes too broad of an issue.
Okay. So that's really helpful for us to understand and to at least figure out where the work needs to be done to make sure that the food supply is safer. I understand that the FDA is thinking about doing some reorganization. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, definitely. What's really interesting is the possibility that the FDA will be split into two agencies. One that focuses solely on drugs and pharmaceuticals and medical biologics, and the other being primarily focused on food safety and food. And I think this came about because 80% of the resources that the FDA has is concentrated on regulating and overseeing any issues in the drug, pharmaceutical, and medical industries, whereas only a meager 20% is put towards regulating food. And so unfortunately, a lot of things kind of slide under. There's just not enough resources. There's not enough people working on these issues, and it's just a huge backlog. So by splitting it into two agencies that are able to, obtain federal grants and funding, you will start to see some more, potentially more oversight, and hopefully a stronger food supply, as well as reduction in food safety issues.
What's the reason for why the FDA doesn't regulate supplements? Do you know?
This one is a very tricky piece because the supplement industry has always been this fine line between they don't say that the supplements treat anything, so it's obviously not a drug, right? But it's a little higher than a food, so it lives in this gray area where it's not quite regulated at this, at the strictness of a drug, while some supplements should be because of their impact on the biological human system. But there's a decades long industry of supplements that have combated federal oversight, and I think it's understandable because, again, we're not saying that they treat anyone. We're not saying that XYZ supplement is supposed to, be a cure. But of course, there's bad players and there's very savvy marketing that basically undercuts those. And people, are unfortunately do not understand these issues because people aren't educated about them. Supplements are really very, very unfortunate, underregulated area. And it's just been a lot of lobbying is involved and a lot of top players are involved. There's a lot of money to be made in the supplement industry, for better or worse.
So supplements aren't a drug.
Right.
But they're also not a food then.
Right.
Help me understand. Is that what I'm led to believe? What is it?
Yeah, that's what are supplements, right? And then in some categorizations, you could say that, it is actually a food, because they do come from food sources, or at least a good number of supplements do. But then you have supplements that don't come from food or are synthetically produced, and you're like, what is this? Like, just because you're saying it's not treating a human disease, like it's also just odd component that you can take and ingest and somehow it does something. I mean, certainly that's what's marketed, but it's also, there's interesting things that people get involved in or interested in terms of, treating things on the side. I mean, I don't want to point fingers, but certainly, nutraceutical industry pairs up with certain non-medical professionals, and I do say that there are some naturopaths that are not good players, and they do push things to be said like, oh, this should help with this and that, but there's no scientific evidence for that. So it's very bizarre. It's a very bizarre gray area.
So we got a big gaping hole somehow that somebody needs to take on and fill, it sounds like. So tell me a little bit about what happened under the Trump administration when it came to regulating food. I understand that there were some changes made.
Yeah, absolutely. There was certainly rollbacks in terms of addressing climate change. And there was a number of different initiatives to ensure that, we were using fewer fertilizers, and we were considering organic agriculture as a possible remedy for a lot of the issues such as chemical runoff. And those got rolled back. And then the big one was in the poultry industry, there is regulations and oversight for egg products and poultry products, and those got rolled back, and that resulted in an increase in a number of food safety concerns and issues. A number of companies demonstrated, questionable practices as far as ensuring a safe food supply, and there was an increase in recalls.
So without naming any companies, because, I'm not in the shame business, I just want to understand it a little bit better. So you talk about poultry. What was something that got rolled back what was a questionable practice that people should be aware of, at least that was happening during that time?
Yeah, certainly there was a need for additional testing for salmonella, because salmonella is a big major concern as far as a pathogen that gets spread very easily by poultry products. And so there was more strict traceability questions of, how do you test this? How much should you test? And certainly that was all before the Trump administration. And then those got rolled back because they were deemed they were cost effective, essentially, those testing procedures. Which was really one of the first lines of defense as far as ensuring that, we didn't get salmonella in our food supply. So it's very disconcerting.
So when the administrations changed, when it became the Biden administration, did any of those scary things get fixed?
Certainly, there was new executive orders for addressing issues of climate change, and as well as putting more resources in implementing organic food production and organic agriculture. And then there was also re-implementation of the Food Modernization Act, or Food Safety Modernization Act, because a lot of those were put through by the Obama administration, and then once we went to the Trump administration, some of those didn't get implemented, or the FDA kind of hedged a little bit, and then now those got re-implemented under the Biden administration.
What were some of the things in the Modernization Act that you mentioned?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the big one is traceability, right? So the question of, let's say, a producer of a particular ingredient makes a large lot, say, of a particular product, and then another food company has to use that particular ingredient. So then it goes through a distribution chain. So it doesn't go directly to that food company. Usually it goes through a number of different players along the food supply, which then distribute and kind of break up the lots and make them into cases so that they can be easily sold. Not every company needs 10,000 pounds of, I don't know, cornstarch, right? Some of them only need 100 pounds. So there's a lot of brokers in between that determine that kind of that separation and division.
Hey, this is Dr. Tracy. I am such a tease. I know you enjoyed what you heard, so join me over on patreon.com/Tracy Explains to hear or see the episode. There are 3 great membership options. See you there.